Why don't we simply start?
Yes, good.
Good evening. Can you hear me? I know it may shock some of the Italian people here, but we're actually starting early, so I hope you will forgive us for that. All right, I'm Shaul Bassi from Ca' Foscari University, and I've been asked by our very generous host, Querini Stampalia, to say a few words also on their behalf. So welcome to Querini Stampalia, and as Ca' Foscari, we are very, very pleased to be here, and we're really thanking them for their hospitality. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Stephen Greenblatt, that is currently in Venice to teach at the Harvard Ca' Foscari Summer School. So immediately I want to thank the Harvard Ca' Foscari Harvard Summer School for sharing him with another program. We are in the midst of Humanities and Social Change Summer Institute. I represent here the Humanities and Social Change Center at Ca' Foscari University of Venice, which is a relatively new enterprise, public humanities cross-disciplinary center that has twin centers in other universities, Cambridge, UK, Humboldt in Berlin, and particularly University of California at Santa Barbara. So I'm very, very happy to welcome friend and colleague Thomas Carlson, who is the director of the center, and the other colleagues who are here with us, and all the fellows of the Ca' Foscari and the Santa Barbara centers. We are doing a really intensive summer institute, and I asked Stephen Greenblatt the permission to read a short quote. As you're going to hear, there are countless versions of the Adam and Eve story, but one that we find in a 17th century book called Divrei Adam, or Adam's Hebrew Dictionary. It says, "At this time, God's new neophyte, freshman of greater understanding than standing in the flourishing University of Eden, had a shrewd though glorious lesson imposed upon him by his master, rector of the round ruling globe." So, this is the Eden as a university and God as the rector. Please report this to our rector when you're here. All right, this summer school is on fact and value in public life. And I think it would be fair to say that Stephen Greenblatt has really taught us, students, scholars, readers, to read facts and values differently in literature. New historicism, that is the theoretical school that he's basically the founder of, taught us to read facts and specifically anecdotes as very telling signs in literary text. And rather than the old historicist way, when we used to, let's say, try to read a text as a reflection of a specific value system, he really taught us to read competing and rival value systems struggling within the same text. And we are absolutely, I think it's fair to say that Shakespeare studies and early modern studies have not been the same since his books. But Stephen Greenblatt has not only been an incredibly influential scholar in academic circles, he's also a fantastic storyteller and writer for a more general readership. So if, again, many of us learn from his famous book, Shakespearean Negotiations and Learning to Curse and Marvelous Possessions, in more recent years, he has written more and more widely, both in terms of the scope of his themes and in terms of his readership. And it's no accident that he was awarded that, among other prizes, the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. Before that, I want to remember this beautiful biography of Shakespeare, Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare, and Hamlet in Purgatory. More recently, he is the author of The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, that is going to be the topic of today's lecture, and his most recent publication has two different titles, am I correct?
Yes, one in England, one in the United States.
Okay, so in the United States it's called
Tyrant.
Tyrant.
It's actually called Tyrant in both places.
Oh, it's
Just
called
different
Tyrant.
subtitles.
Okay, so it's basically about Shakespeare and Donald Trump, but we're not, it's more complicated, but I mean, it shows how Shakespeare is relevant to interpret modern times. For the sake of the Italian readers, I want to mention, and also to help our interpreter, thank you, I want to say that the title of his Italian publications are Il Manoscritto, that's the Swerve, and again, the original title of the Shakespeare biography was Vita, Arte, Passioni di William Shakespeare Capocomico, but the new revised edition is called Shakespeare, Una Vita a Teatro.
Exactly.
Okay, that's short. All right. I'm sure we're all looking forward to listening to him. He will give an initial presentation, and then there will be a rich Q&A session. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Greenblatt.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, of course, to my friend and collaborator, Shaul Bassi. I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm very honored and I'm grateful to the Fondazione Querini Stampalia for this wonderful space, this marvelous hospitality. It's a pleasure to talk about this book on the occasion of the Italian translation. Shaul has already given me a way in to talk about it because I've been interested really for as long as I can remember. Anecdotes of short stories. And the most powerful short stories tell us a huge amount about the world. And perhaps the greatest short story ever written is the one that this book is about. The story of Adam and Eve that occupies only the first 3 chapters, less actually than the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. It takes place in a tiny compass, and at the same time, it turns out to be perhaps the most important and influential imaginative creation in all of recorded history, certainly in all of Western history. It was probably written, as far as we know, written down in the 6th century before the Common Era, but it comes from much later than that. And something about its extraordinary power of concentration is what lies behind my original fascination with it. One thing we know about the story of Adam and Eve is that the briefest sketch, a little pencil sketch of a couple of naked people and a tree, preferably a tree that has a fruit on it, immediately takes us to the story. And in this case, you might not be able to read the line, but they're imagining that there might be a book in this, and it turns out that there was one. It's a special pleasure, of course, to talk about this story of Adam and Eve in this place, not only because, of course, as many of us believe, we're as close to being in paradise as we're likely to get, but also because it is, as you probably all know, a city that announces itself in a very strange and powerful way from already the 14th century on, in relation to the story of Adam and Eve on the, I think, southwest corner of the Doge's palace. There is, from the middle of the 14th century, the ill-fated Filippo Calendario's sculpture of Adam and Eve, which was a way, in effect, of signaling something that's been true for centuries and centuries, which is the welcome, basically, to people of all faiths, of all ethnicities, of all identities, as long as they behave themselves reasonably well. That's also what the sculpture seems to say, as it welcomes people when they arrive from the sea to the center of this remarkable place. And it's not, by the way, only that corner, that remarkable. Maybe I'll put this down because I'm hearing an echo. Can you hear an echo when I speak? Oh, okay, then it's okay. It's not only that remarkable corner, but as you know, if you've entered the Doge's palace, there are also 2 further representations of Adam and Eve by Antonio Rizzo from the late 15th century that are very prominently placed, as if to say that if you're in Venice, it's very important to understand this story. There's Rizzo's Adam, there's his Eve, and the Eve has a remarkable way of pointing to what becomes, it turns out, one of the central issues of the whole account of the nature of the woman, and particularly the power of sex. But we'll take a step back. Already Charles, in introducing me, said that that my work is interested, and obviously it's true for many of us, in alternative accounts. And we know about the creation story that virtually all peoples have speculated about the creation of the world and the creation of the first humans. That's one of the characteristics of us as a species, that we come up with stories about our creation, which, as far as we know, our other species don't, even our closest primate relatives don't seem to do. And in the case of the story of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, from that part of the world, there's a much older story, older, we think, than certainly older in its survival than anything that we know from the Hebrew world, which was the Sumerian story that's recorded in the Enuma Elish. That story imagined the world in somewhat similar terms, in the sense that humans were created out of clay to work in a garden, but really work in a garden, to dig the irrigation ditches that the junior gods didn't feel like digging any longer, and that the senior god and then allowed, there are multiple versions of this story in the Sumerian version, but allowed a great one of the gods to create in order to relieve the burden of working in the garden. So humans were created to do this, and it was a successful idea in the sense that the junior gods could relax. The hard work was done by these creatures created, but it had both a wonderful idea built into it, but also a problem, which was that the humans reproduced, as we do. We tend to do that. And also, as we tend to do, they made a racket. They made a lot of noise. And particularly the babies, as you may have noticed, often can make a lot of noise. And the senior god, Apsu, became increasingly enraged that he couldn't sleep in the afternoon. He was constantly being awakened, and so he decided that it would be better to let the junior gods go back to doing the work, and he decided to destroy all the humans. And he tried multiple times to do it with plague and with fire. Each time, one of the cleverest gods who happened to like a particular human warned the human. The population was drastically reduced, but the humans survived and began to reproduce, and the same problem kept arising until finally the senior god decided once and for all to get rid of these annoying creatures with a gigantic flood. But here too, the god favorable to humans allowed gave the human advice. No, it's okay. Oh, okay. Gave the humans advice, human advice to build an ark and to escape the flood, and that's what happened. And only after that, the senior god Apsu decided, all right, I will do a kind of agreement with you. We'll allow humans to survive, but we'll just reduce the population effectively by killing a lot of infants and women in childbirth to reduce the population. So that's the way that story works to explain human suffering and misery. It has nothing to do with human transgression. It just has to do with the fact that we reproduce. And that it annoys people. The amount of noise that we make can annoy someone. It's in a way, brilliant at once anticipation and alternative to the story that the Hebrews who heard the Enuma Elish many, many times when they were in exile in Babylon, the Hebrews came up with an alternative account. And the alternative account is, of course, the one that we've inherited, that the Jews and the Muslims, and above all, the Christians who embraced the story for reasons we could talk about, made at the very center, really, of their vision of the world. Okay, I want to jump from very, very ancient times, from the Enuma Elish, to the earliest representation that I know of, visual representation of Adam and Eve. The Hebrews, of course, had a prohibition that kept them from making iconic representations of their stories, but the Christians did not. And here in the 3rd century of the Common Era in Rome, in the catacomb of Pietro Marcellino, there is a very early and quite, I think, fascinating representation of the first humans. You get to it by passing through many cubiculi where there are painted scenes, and most of the painted scenes, as you know, those of you who visited catacombs, or you would expect, are in effect consolations or encouragements for those people who were visiting the dead. So there are scenes that, like this. Do you recognize that? Who is that? Just Noah, yes, exactly. Who is coming out like the Jack-in-the-Box out of the ark. Or this, maybe slightly harder to recognize. That's Jonah, yes, that's right, coming out of a very, very odd-looking sea creature. Certainly not a whale, but that was, anyway, a later idea. And then, if you go deep in, and you get permission from the Vatican to go deep into the catacomb, you come on a less encouraging representation, not of salvation, but of shame. And you get the earliest representation of Adam and Eve. And it's worth conjuring up, at least that I know of, it's worth conjuring up that at this moment in the 3rd century, if you went up into the sunlight, you would see lots of representations of naked humans in their glory, or gods in their glory. But here, the emphasis is on humans in disgrace and shame, covering themselves. And that's, of course, because humans have brought about the fact that people like this workman, this remarkable painting that they did of the workman who digs these graves, that the workmen are digging the graves because of what Adam and Eve brought into the world, namely death. So that you're in the catacomb, you're down there because of what they did at the beginning of time. This is the beginning, in effect, in the visual arts of an enormous and unbelievably rich set of representations in Christian culture of visual representations of the first humans. I won't obviously I'll make only the tiniest gesture toward this tradition. We jump ahead by 7 or 8 centuries to the Hildesheim Doors in Germany, where those marvelous bronze doors made by Bishop Barnward in the 11th century, where, as you can see, God is pointing the finger at Adam. Adam is pointing under his arm to the person he thinks is principally responsible for what happened. And Eve is, of course, pointing down to the strange-looking serpent who is responsible. So that question of who is responsible for this act is represented for this catastrophe that's led to all of our woes, is represented over and over again in, as we'll see, in even a tiny number of images that I'll show you, but in multiple ways is represented as in a series of extraordinary alternatives. Because the story is simultaneously unbelievably simple and unbelievably complicated, like all great stories. And its brevity helps to intensify the peculiarity of the story. The story seems fantastically simple and apprehendable. When you hear it at 5 years old, you get it. And at the same time, it is full of pitfalls and difficulties. So much so that the ancient rabbis thought that you shouldn't tell a story ever to a child. That you should only encounter the story of Adam and Eve when you're an adult. But even as an adult, it turns out there are problems. The earliest trace that we have of the story from the Nag Hammadi codices that were dug up, but from several thousand years ago, the earliest traces of the story, interpretive traces of the story, argue that the hero of the story was clearly the woman, because the woman made the choice of knowledge against a punitive God who seems to want to keep humans from knowing. And there was an alternative version that the hero of the story was the serpent, who wanted to give humans knowledge. That's from 2,000 years ago. That is to say, it's not a contemporary perception of something wrong with the story or problematical about the story, that as far back as we can go, people understood that the story was written by Franz Kafka. And that generated an enormous body of interpretive adventure in relation to the story of Adam and Eve, particularly interpretive adventure and difficulty because of the central, there are many, many problems, but the central paradox of the prohibition. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that, maybe we can talk about it together. The paradox of the prohibition being the first humans are under a strict injunction not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But how could they obey a prohibition of that kind if they didn't know what the difference between good and evil was? And as I say, that's not a modern perception, that's a very ancient perception of something deeply troubling in the story that needs explanation. And the trouble only became more and more intense when the Christians, for reasons of their own, embraced the story powerfully because of Jesus being the new Adam, as St. Paul said. And in embracing the story, and particularly under the influence of St. Augustine, decided to try to take the story, to interpret the story, as Augustine says, ad litteram, to the letter, whatever that means. So in many medieval representations, as here in the illumination of Peter Comestor's, this is a way most people wouldn't have read the Bible in the Middle Ages, but they would have read texts like Peter Comestor. You can see that the attempt to read it ad litteram means that you take seriously the idea that it's a rib, and the God here looks like he's handling a stick puppet, putting a little head on the rib, and he hasn't yet got to make the rest of the body. But what happens over a very long period of time, both in art and in theology, is that the attempt to take seriously the injunction, the Augustinian injunction to treat the story literally, whatever that means, leads people to try to treat it more and more, with more and more, how should we say, realistic intensity. So you get from the 12th century, Giselbertus at the Church of Autun in France, giving us this very strange and very powerful Eve on a lintel above one of the entries to the church, where the figure is extremely complex in the sense that the level of responsibility is quite unclear. Does she know what she's doing? She's reaching back. Does she know what her hand is doing back there? Is she fully conscious? Is she down partly on her knees because she's already ashamed? Or does she not know? What's the meaning of her contemplative look? What, for that matter, is the meaning of the erotic appeal to us as we pass under that figure? She's clearly extremely beautiful. And how do we interpret what her body does very strangely, which is to turn? The turn is non-naturalistic, but is hidden precisely there in the middle of her body in that peculiar calling attention to and hiding that we saw in the Antonio Rizzo at the beginning of this. So these are deep questions that are asked again and again, and in some sense have already reached their culmination in the 15th century in Masaccio's celebrated figures in the Church of the Carmine, where the full force of what it means to be expelled as human beings from naked from a perfect place. Of course, actually, Masaccio goes further than the biblical text, because they weren't naked when they were expelled. They were already partly dressed by God. But here they're really radically naked as they're driven out of paradise across that threshold. When I first saw that image when I was young, they were wearing, as it was appropriate actually biblically for them to wear, they were wearing their leaves. But that was discovered that was a later addition. And then the fresco was cleaned, and it turned out that they were radically naked. And that, in fact, Masaccio went out of his way to call attention to both to Eve's attempt to cover herself in shame and disgrace and radical abjection, and Adam's nakedness, his exposure, as he covers his face, but his exposure of his genitals. Just to pursue for a few more minutes, in some ways the most influential representation in the visual arts of Adam and Eve was this copper plate engraving from the early 16th century by Albrecht Dürer. Tremendously important because in the case, if you want to see Masaccio, you have to go to the Church of the Carmine in Florence. But this could be printed as it was in many, many, many versions and sold across Europe. Dürer wanted to make sure that you understood this was made by Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg, and that he was actually that he was there, as it were, and saw what was going on, and this fantastically beautiful, especially the figure of Adam, which he worked on for years and years and years, to copying the classical statuary that was being dug up in the Renaissance at this point. Adam and Eve captured at the moment just before the disaster. How do you know it's the moment just before the disaster? Because you can see that there are many details, but you can see that Adam has his right foot lightly resting on the tail of a little mouse, just being regarded with a certain kind of sleepy attention by that cat. And we know that as soon as he actually takes the fruit, which is being passed evidently from the serpent to Eve, and which he will pass to his waiting hand, that mouse is toast. But not yet. Not yet. It's the not quite yet. And this is the last moment in which the human body was perfect, in which all relations were perfect, in which innocence was whole. And as I say, this image circulated enormously widely, and almost all artists after 1504, in some way or other, are playing with alternatives to what Dürer offered. This, I don't know if you can see it, yes, clearly after Jan Hosart, is an Adam and Eve that are no longer, as it were, standing side by side, but in which is very often it's represented the Eve is somehow over Adam. And this is part of a long, intensely misogynistic tradition that evolved from the story. The story caused, it's fair to say, a great deal of damage to women over the centuries. It's not the only account. As I said, the earliest trace of the story we have is one in which Eve is the hero, but certainly the alternative, the misogynistic alternative, is represented again and again, either in this form with a dominant woman, or which I showed you because here in this Fondazione there's a Palma il Giovane that you may have seen on the poster. That is basically a variation of this, with a dominant Eve and an Adam that is seeming to receive this down with very little agency, or images like this one by Dürer's demonic and brilliant student, Hans Baldung Green, in which the Eve is Miss Seductress, sexy seductress, in which she's in some bizarre relation to an Adam who's already turned into a rotting corpse because of what she's initiated. My book takes us through, my book is not a book of art history, it takes us through a long interpretive tradition in art, but also in literature. The literature that climaxes with Milton's Paradise Lost, and the general direction that I trace in the book, which is, I believe, what happened, at least that's the argument in my book, the plot of my book, is that people got better and better in art and theology and in literature at taking seriously, at making good on the claim that you have to take the story ad literam, which they interpreted increasingly to make the story real, to make Adam and Eve real, and the literary climax of that is Milton. Milton writes a whole epic poem that does the most astonishing things with the figures of Adam and Eve, of actually giving them a relationship, a marriage, before the fall and after as well, but trying to think of what that relationship would have been like, what their sex would have been like, what their conversations would have been like, how they ate together, and what it meant to be a couple in paradise, which no one had ever succeeded in literature in doing. The lines that I have on the screen here are ones that convey very much what Dürer was trying to do. I think Milton probably almost certainly saw Dürer's print before he went blind. What happens in Milton is he tries to figure out the problem that has remained a vexing one from the ancient world all the way through Kierkegaard and into the present. How do you ever get from innocence to guilt? And how is the line possibly crossed? And in Milton's case, Adam and Eve have been warned by an angel that there's an enemy out there, and Adam makes the mistake, it turns out, of telling Eve that she'd better stay by his side. I'll protect you, because the wife should stay by her husband's side, who will guard her. And Eve takes exception to this. Frail is our happiness, she says, if this be so, and Eden were no Eden, thus exposed. Eden were no Eden. She says, I might as well have stayed a rib if I was supposed to stay with you all the time. It makes that joke, as it were. And Adam says, go, for thy stay not free absents thee more. Because Milton's Adam understands that actually if you force someone to stay with you, they're actually further away from you. That's also part of Milton's, probably Milton's reflection on his own miserable marriage, but also Milton's reflection on what the story actually could possibly mean if you took it literally, if you took it seriously. So Eve then says, with thy permission then, I'll go off. And that's why she's apart. And that's a kind of culminating thought of something that had bothered people from the ancient world on. Why weren't they together when the serpent came? The ancient rabbis had a series of speculations. Some rabbis thought that maybe they had sex and Adam was having a nap. That's one very ancient speculation. A sort of afternoon nap. Or another was that Adam was wandering around looking at the garden, which he hadn't seen adequately before, and Eve was alone. But this is the explanation, because freedom means that you actually have to face these things by yourself. All right. It's not an accident, super quickly, it's not an accident that Milton's Paradise Lost was written in the 17th century in the last possible moment of holding on in the deepest way to the meaning of this story, not only because it's the culmination, Milton's Paradise Lost is the culmination of a Renaissance technology in literature and art that makes things more and more and more real. Milton is the heir to Shakespeare, but it's also not an accident because the story, at the very moment that it becomes at its most intense and real, begins to fray, begins to crack, and people begin to have more and more intense doubts about whether they can believe in the story. And one source of the doubt had to do with the fact that Europeans, starting in the 1492 and thereafter, kept encountering more and more naked people who did not seem to need to cover their genitals, were not ashamed. And that became a kind of major problem because that shame was supposed to be part of the human destiny after the fall. How is it possible that they weren't? Didn't they get the news that they were supposed to be ashamed? And there are many, many representations, speculations about what this could possibly mean. that you keep encountering naked people. To some extent, it's the good news for Europeans, because as you can see, they're armed and the natives are naked. But it also becomes a theological problem of a very serious kind. And you keep feeling it. I think you keep feeling it in representations. This is Trevet's representation from Brazil of oddly evocative of the story of Adam and Eve, of naked people under a tree from which fruit is falling. And it's not only in the New World. Here's Theodore de Brye's image from the East Indies. They begin to find more naked people there as well. And then Thomas Harriot, in a way, closes the circle. This is Thomas Harriot's account of Virginia. He went to Virginia, and he had an illustrator come with him, John White, who did drawings of the Virginian Indians, the Algonquian Indians. But the drawings of the Algonquian Indians begin in the edition, the de Brye edition of Harriot's account of his voyage to Virginia, with a depiction of Adam and Eve. Because you can't think about the Indians without thinking about Adam and Eve as well, and trying to understand what that story means, and what it means to find people in the world that you didn't expect to find. The theology had worked out that the sons of Noah, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, had spread out to the three parts of the world, to Asia, to the Middle East, and to Europe. But where did they come from in America? How did they get there? And that also posed a tremendous problem starting in the 16th and 17th century with the story. So one person I write about in the book who tried to solve this problem was a strange, fascinating character named Isaac La Peyrère, a 17th century Protestant, who came up with the idea. He actually already had it as a child in Sunday school. He said, when the Bible says that Cain married a woman from the land of Nod, what could it possibly mean? Where is there a woman in the land of Nod? Where did she come from? And why was he afraid people were going to kill him? There apparently were only at that point two people in the world, beyond two children of Adam and Eve. But he was told to shut up at that time. But then when he became an adult and he had protection, he wrote, he developed this idea, and he published a book called Men Before Adam, that the world was full of humans before Adam. He believed in the story of Adam and Eve, but that was only a Jewish story, the story about the Jews and their descendants, ultimately the Christians. But there must have been other human beings in the world before. For writing that, he had a free trip to Rome with an armed guard, and he had a conversation with the Pope directly. The Pope gave him the choice of defending this thesis and being burned at the stake, or renouncing it. And quite sensibly, Isaac La Peyrère said, no, I had been deceived by my Calvinist education, and I have decided to renounce this idea, and he was allowed to live. But the problems don't go away. This is a wonderful Cranach from London of Adam and Eve, in which you can see Adam scratching his head. That's the problem of what is this? How can I possibly understand? How can I understand? I've received a warning that if I eat this, I'll die, but I forgot to ask what death is. That's also one of the problems that people notice originally in the story. Oh, sorry. Good. So, when we have something that's poisonous, that might actually destroy lots of people, we tend to put fences around it to guard people from it. And we also worry not only about where we'll store this stuff and but we worry about how to indicate to people that they better watch out. So, as you probably know, we've tried with our nuclear waste to figure out what signs we could put up for people who 10,000 years from now may not speak our language. So that question, the ethical question of what it means to put something that is extremely dangerous in the reach of people who may not understand what it is a problem that basically arose tormentingly, most intensely starting in the 17th and 18th century in the thought of European Christians who were worrying about how to make moral sense of the story. Just briefly to bring us to the end, there was also a set of questions that began to arise when people began to do anatomies, physical anatomies, and think about what the bodies what human bodies are and what their morphological similarities were to other bodies, to the other skeletons. It's very striking that at this anatomy theater in Leiden, there are figures of Adam and Eve and a tree here in front of the anatomy theater in which they're doing an anatomy of a corpse. They're trying to sort out what the relationship is between the rising science of here from the 17th century on and the biblical story, and they're extremely hard to keep together. This is one of the great last attempts by a physicist, biologist, and fossil collector named Schweitzer in the 18th century, where he tries to write a book of modern physics, of natural science, together with images of Adam and Eve, trying to figure out what the nature of the body is of death, and the body is in some relation to this story in which we were not apparently originally intended to die. How can we put these things together? The answer is that it's fantastically difficult to put together. But what happens is that the story begins to pull apart, where the natural science world and the rational world of the Enlightenment grows increasingly anxious or incapable of understanding, of any longer acceding to the biblical story, at the same time that it continues to have enormous ethical power. In which the realization of Adam and Eve as real people continues and intensifies. In some ways, this is the most remarkable, I think, image of all, Rembrandt's Adam and Eve, in which we're always said about Adam and Eve to be looking at our first parents. But of course, if they're incredibly beautiful, like Dürer's Adam and Eve, we're actually not exactly looking at our first parents. Here we really are looking at, in the way that as a teenager you don't want to look at your parents. They have real bodies, unnervingly familiar bodies showing age, showing signs of the decay before anything has happened to them. Okay, this is a tradition that goes all the way into, very powerfully, into 20th and 21st century art. This is Beckmann's Adam and Eve. Where I'll leave you is with a different inheritance of the story of Adam and Eve. This from the Natural History Museum in New York. The scientists who tried to imagine what Lucy, the Australopithecus, whom we now think is our ancestor, looked like, came up with this diorama, which to me, I think, and I hope to you, is unmistakably an allusion to the Adam and Eve story, even though it is actually a completely phantasmatic attempt to figure out what those footprints, that's all that survives. It was footprints in a bed of fossilized mud. The footprints might have been from several thousand years apart, but we imagine them as our first ancestors. And the question that remains, and the one that I also try to explore in my book, is what's the relationship between our origin account, which imagines ourselves, as I believe we must be, descended from these creatures, and the Adam and Eve story. Because this is a very recent account, and maybe it's not surprising that we have a great deal of difficulty figuring out how these creatures got to speak language, make choices, have ethical reasoning, think about their lives in the way that we think about our lives, all things that are built into the biblical story. So the biblical story continues to live as at least as I argue in my book, as a sublime work of literature, even though it has become, to many of us, not 40% of my fellow Americans, but to many of us actually, in any literal sense, unbelievable. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop here.
You know that Stephen Greenblatt is an amazing storyteller. We've had another wonderful example of that, and I wholeheartedly recommend the book because, as you have heard, there's so many narratives, so many different meanings, so many themes that the Adam and Eve story has been used to articulate. And so, just one question I would like to ask is maybe to give us a glimpse into your creative process, because of course dealing with Adam and Eve means dealing with an inordinate amount of material, iconographic material, literary material, and at the end, as usual, you create a fantastic plot with some prominent characters. First character in the story is Stephen Greenblatt as a child in the synagogue, and the last chapter is Stephen Greenblatt as an adult hanging out with apes in a forest. But in between, the reader finds St. Augustine and of course John Milton and then Darwin. So the question is, when you started researching and then writing the book, did you already know who the main characters were going to be, or it was the research that then tried to do? Of course, you could imagine, before I start reading the book, I imagined that Paradise Lost would feature to some extent, but I think that the selection of the material and the characters.
Paradise Lost for sure, that of course anyone like myself who trained in English literature, and not only in English literature, because there's nothing like Paradise Lost there are other remarkable examples in France and in Germany. In Italy, I'm not sure anyone did quite, Italian art, but not in literature in quite the same way. But that said, no, I had no idea where this could possibly go. I knew I wanted to try to write something about this, and I trusted, but at a certain point I began to get panicky that my trust might be misplaced, that some story would emerge. I knew that I couldn't possibly, I knew that I had no right to write this, but I had already come to grips with long ago with the fact that I don't have a right to write about anything. None of us do. I mean, we never know enough. And this is an extreme case of not knowing enough. I certainly don't know enough. They would take multiple lifetimes and a brain transplant and so forth and so on to make it possible to actually possess this subject. But I thought, all right, around this astonishing poem in the 17th century, I thought about Michelangelo, the Sistine Ceiling. I thought about a series of why is it that these extraordinary Renaissance and Masaccio, which I briefly mentioned, these extraordinary representations concentrate in the Renaissance so powerfully. But I didn't know where it was going to take me. And what slowly emerged was the fact that there had been a struggle, an intense struggle, when, in the wake of St. Paul, when Christians made the decision, under the influence of Paul, to have to think seriously about the Adam and Eve story. I say they made a decision because there was an argument. There's always arguments. There was a proposal, a very strong proposal, centered on a first century theologian named Marcion, who said, get rid of it. Let's scrap the whole thing. The story is ethically incoherent. Marcion thought that most of the Hebrew stories that the Christians were relying on made no sense whatsoever ethically, and that Christians could do without them. And there was a struggle in very early Christianity that Marcion was ruled a heretic and exiled, and the outcome ultimately, there was an argument between basically certain sophisticated current of Judaism and early Christianity, represented by Philo and Origen, who had allegorical. One way of dealing with an unbelievably problematical Kafka-like story is to allegorize it. So it isn't really a snake, and it wasn't really a tree, and there was no garden. These are kind of allegories of the soul and moral choice and so forth and so on. That would have been the smart, sensible way of dealing with the story. But of course, in theological arguments of this kind, that way always loses in the end. And the way that won was the brilliant but devastatingly difficult way that was Augustine. So Augustine became a crucial nodal point. And then once I got Augustine and figured out why Augustine had this astonishing stake in the story, that actually began to direct me. And in brief, the key element here is to understand that in the case of Augustine or Albrecht Dürer or Milton, anyone who came to the story who wanted to make a difference in it had to bring his entire life to the story, body and soul. Every part of Augustine is there, every part of Dürer, every part of Milton. That's the nature of the story, that's the demand. And that's my only justification for bringing myself so prominently also at the beginning and end, because I felt I was obliged to say why I'm here, why am I doing this? How does this story work for me? And that is the argument that I would like to make to you, basically, about the way great art works. That's why we care about great art. About the works of art, works in painting or sculpture or literature or music, that if they really mean something, you have to bring your whole self to them. You don't check yourself at the guardaroba. You go into the room with it. And that is absolutely centrally true about every figure in my book who turned the story in the direction that it went. Ultimately, including Darwin, whose way of dealing with the story was systematically to ignore it, though he was intensely aware of it in every move he was making.
So on a related note, what is happening to the story of Adam and Eve now in the United States? Because from the perspective of an Italian reader, of course you can say there's a rise of fundamentalism in different countries, European countries, United States, but for sure, may be wrong in that, but for Catholic fundamentalists, the fact that Adam and Eve may be an actual true story is not really an issue. Whether in some radical Protestant circles, that's actually still a problem. And so, could you say something about the use of Adam and Eve or of the Bibles as actual truth in the current political?
Yes. I mean, one thing I would say for a start is that at a very early stage, also in writing this book, I had a long walk. It was in the middle of the winter. It was out west, and I was on snowshoes, and thinking about whether I could write this book or not. And I was thinking about those people, as I said briefly at the end. Many, if you can believe the polls, many Americans profess to believe in the literal truth of this story in the face of everything of the last, at least the science of the last several hundred years. So I thought, what am I to do with this? And I realized that it would be fatal spiritually for me, fatal as to enter this project thinking those people are stupid. That's not the way to proceed. It's not the way to proceed, partly because it's a little difficult as an American not to think that my fellow Americans are stupid right now. I get it. But putting that aside, it's not a healthy way of entering a serious multi-year project in something to think that people who take a story like this seriously and deeply are simply misguided. So I moved in the opposite direction of thinking there's something in this story so powerful, so compelling, that even in the wake of everything that's been discovered about our life on Earth for the last several hundred years, a large number of people still want to cling to it. Why is that? And I start there rather than with simply dismissal. And I think that the intensity with which I would speculate, in any case, that the intensity with which at least a significant number of Americans embrace the story has to do with the rapidity of social and technological change in our society. That I mean, we're obviously the heirs to historically the heirs to Protestants who came from a strong fundamentalist background, who still represent a serious part of our population. But I don't think it's simply that. I think it's the relationship between a strong set of religious beliefs, and the deep utility of the story, and the fact that things are constantly changing, and it's very hard to explain our behavior now. That the moral explanation that is offered by the story, which is that you're making a choice and that you will be punished if you make the wrong choice and so forth, is something that people are clinging to in a world that's changing tremendously rapidly. And it is actually powerful and suggestive.
I think I'll be very happy now to open the debate to questions from the audience. I think this is probably there for the purpose. I don't know if there's anyone here could come here, or maybe. Oh, thank you. Okay. Ci sono. Sorry, I forgot to mention that we are in the most extraordinary place where every single sit is equipped with a microphone. So don't abuse it. But yeah, if you want to ask a question.
My goodness, well, do abuse it.
Yeah. All right.
Do you have to push a button, or do they automatically? My goodness.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Oh, right.
Yes, Carol. Please.
Carol.
So we tell stories, and we circulate stories, and we continue to tell stories because we need them. Going back to Marcion, and him being declared a heretic implies that there was some orthodoxy already there to which he was subverting or disagreeing with. Then you talked about Augustine and his stake in the story. Why do we need this story? Was it to account for death, or was it to account for human error and sin? Why? And when Marcion says, let's just get rid of it, what would we have been getting rid of if we had gotten rid of that story? And I, as a woman, am particularly attuned to this, because we feel very, clearly the history of misogyny. But why did we need that story? Was it about death? Was it about sin? Was it about error? Or was it because there was going to be a book in it?
I think that, of course, I don't have a neat answer to that question. And already, even the way you pose the question suggests that there are a variety of routes that one could take and motives for it. I began with the Enuma Elish because I wanted to suggest that there's a rather strangely parallel alternative that eliminates virtually every one of the terms that you just enumerated. So people clearly did for a long time have, as in other cultures as well, have creation accounts that don't have the elements that you described, that have an alternative set of elements. And it's one of the astonishing things that the Hebrews happens that, as they say, the story is fundamentally, centrally a Christian story. The Hebrews made something of it, but the Hebrews cared mostly about the Abraham story. If they wanted to take a central story about what it meant to be a Jew, it was the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the Hebrews we don't know exactly who they were or how they did this, who came up with this alternative account, I would have said did several things, at least for me, that were important. The Enuma Elish story has no separate creation of men and women. It's just they create humans. And indeed, the great Babylonian story is a male friendship story about Gilgamesh and Enkidu. It's not about men and women. The Hebrew story did something, as far as we know, unknown in that whole part of the world, which is to imagine a fundamental and primary relationship between a man and a woman, in which the man, and as you probably know, in the Hebrew account, expresses a kind of ecstatic pleasure when he sees the woman. In Hebrew, it's zot, this one. He has a kind of poem built around the word this one in Genesis. The rabbis interpreted that in a typically zany way to mean that the ancient rabbis thought that one theory was that Adam had tried sex with all the other animals before then and found it unsatisfactory. And then finally, this one. But that's not the only or even my preferred way of understanding that moment. So instead of beginning with misogyny, I'd like to begin in exactly the opposite place. I think the misogyny is an important element of the story, but not to get the story off the hook. But I think that the misogyny enters the story from the Greeks, basically. That is to say, the Christians who had read Hesiod, who knew the Pandora story, I think imported into this very strong element of blaming the woman, which I think is not actually built, hardwired into the story. In any case, I think that element of fundamental union between a man and a woman, coupled with whatever is meant by, but completely unexplained in the story, by the decision, first on the part of the woman and then on the part of the man, to violate the prohibition. And here Milton, I think, picks up on what I've just said, because Milton, for all of his characteristic attitudes from the 17th century, has the man choose to follow the woman, because he doesn't want another one. He doesn't, even if he could lose another rib, he doesn't want it. And I think, first of all, that is so brilliant. So brilliant as a way of understanding something fundamental about our origin, about what it means to love somebody else. I mean, if we can now call into question whether it has to be a man and a woman, but to find someone else that you love and will follow anywhere, coupled with the idea that you have to, it can only happen through violating a prohibition. That for me is enough because the punishment aspect of the story, which is deep, deeply wired into the story, seems to me still incomprehensible. What's gained by the punishment? What does it mean that they're punished for doing something they could not possibly have, whose implications they could not possibly have understood? The closest we can get to that, I think now, in the 21st century, is that we understand increasingly that we're in the grip of compulsions over which we have almost no control. That's why people eat McDonald's. These things are weirdly inherited and hardwired, as if someone did something several thousand years ago that compels us to do something now that may not be good for us. And that the story had that kind of strange intuition. One last piece of intuition that in the story is that we originated, which now I think we also believe, that we originated from from monogenesis, not polygenesis. That we're not from lots of different strains. We came from a single African couple, from a single African man, a single African woman, not an African couple, but the mitochondrial Eve. That was also a kind of weird ancient intuition of the story, that there aren't lots of lines that lead to us. Isaac La Peyrère was a very nice man, and he actually had very good social attitudes. But his story would have been very good for slave owners who believed that, and they liked that story, his story, that we came from different strains. He thought we only came from a single one. The Adam and Eve story says the Genesis story says we come just from a single strain. We're all part of the same family. Yes.
Sorry. One, what does it mean to get rid of? When you say, is it possible to get rid of a story? And the second one, which is very connected, is Eve a biological female, or is being a female part of being a human being more generally?
I would say two things. To get rid of means we live in a world in which there are many stories that no longer have life in them, that we've basically buried. We literally buried the Gilgamesh story for 3,000 or 4,000 years, but we also imaginatively bury stories. We get rid of them in that sense. Of course, we'll be the heirs to some extent, in some distant way, but we could forget them in that sense. It's difficult this story is difficult to forget, but one could imagine a world in which this no longer counts. We live with a different set of assumptions. And indeed, in some sense, Darwin's Descent of Man is an encouragement to live with a different set of assumptions about our relation to other animals, our relation to species domination, our moral choices. Though Darwin was only at the very beginning of trying to think of how you would develop a theory of morality, not using this Adam and Eve story, and we could get parallels strained from Nietzsche and so forth. But we could get rid of it in that sense, I think. We're not going to, not in my lifetime, and I wouldn't like us to, because nothing is right, nothing is there in the moment, I think, that gives us an alternative. To your second question about Eve, I would say the original story is at once weird and cunning in thinking that Eve is somehow made of the same body as the man. So on the one hand, you get Eve is just the man and the woman are parts of each other. And as you probably know, I mean, I'm sure you do know what I mean, that in chapter 1 of Genesis, they are the same. Male and female created he them. There's no sexual differentiation. There are two stories of creation that were woven together in Genesis. And they're not the same, they're not from the same time. The story that I've been talking about today, the naked man and woman and talking snake, is probably quite old, probably 600 to 1,000 years older, maybe through oral tradition, many thousands of years older than the priestly story that culminates in the creation of a single creature, but who's both male and female. Male and female created he them in Hebrew. And then they're separated. So not to be evasive at all, but I think in answer to your question, the Genesis has it both ways. They're not separate creatures that can be in dialogue with each other because they're identical. They're hermaphroditic, they're however it is imagined. Or they are actually separate, but they're still actually made of the same body. Male and female, but actually two different figures. Even though you could trace them back to the same single body. It, again, like so many things in the story, seems like a brilliant imaginative hypothesis by people to whom we have almost no access any longer in terms of where this must have been way pre anything that we would call Judaism or Hebrew. I mean, this is very, very old oral story from some mythic part of human existence. Yes.
Thank you for your words. I'm thinking there about stories and how we have the same narrative, the same story, but spoken in different mouths, so different people saying the same story, and how that changes how it's heard. For example, I'm training to be a Catholic priest, and this is a story I have to know well, I have to learn it in the Hebrew as well, and it's a story I'll have to stand up on a Sunday and talk about and try and shed light on, which is quite a daunting task. And I think one of the biggest obstacles I've found is within Christianity is we jump to the new Adam and the new Eve rather than staying with Adam and Eve first. We jump to the next bit. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, how the story changes depending on whose mouth it's in, who's given the story, and how that can shape how it's heard.
Yes. I mean, your reference to the new Adam and the new Eve is quite fascinating to me, and I would actually like to hear you more about that. It's also true, as you probably know, within in modern Jewish orthodoxy, that could trace itself back to Maimonides. There's a parallel, but obviously profoundly different, attempt to reach a notion of a new Adam, not in this case through the Redeemer, but through some thinking of what it would mean to be not alone any longer, to find some companion, some fit companion. In the case of the Christian tradition, one thing that fascinates me, I walked through the Academia today looking for Adam and Eve in honor of this occasion, and there are actually very few images of Adam and Eve in the Academia, even little allusions, except a single one that is very omnipresent, which is the skull at the foot of the bleeding Jesus on the cross. Because there's a long, as you know, there's a long imagining, a long tradition of depicting that skull as the skull of Adam, almost in the interpretive tradition, and indeed there's many legends about the wood from the cross coming from a seed planted in Adam's mouth, and so forth and so on. And the sight of the body, the bleeding body on the cross, as the rising up from the skull on the ground to the bleeding body on the cross, and to whatever redemption comes on the other side of the human suffering, which is the punishment, which is taking on the punishment that humans had to endure because of the transgression. That's at the very center of, I would have thought of, not to put words in your mouth, but of what you do need to articulate somehow from your pulpit, and what lies on the other side of that suffering. If you're not focused solely on the sacrifice that Jesus made to redeem humans from the sin of the first humans, what we are on the other side of this, who've apparently been redeemed but are still such miserable sinners, I wish you luck.
If I may jump in for a second, it strikes me how the image of Adam and Eve is not only a retrospective look into the origins of our civilization, but it's also a recurring image of how we could start over, like new Adams and Eves on desert islands or planets. So
absolutely. I mean, lots of movies are made on this premise, mostly bad movies, but yes, absolutely.
Thank you for the speech. It's really wonderful. And I'd like to know the role of Adam and Eve in a Muslim tradition, for example, because it's quite interesting.
Yes.
Because they are no sinner. They are sinner, but God forgive them. So it's quite interesting. And I want to know the role of the devil. It's quite interesting too.
I didn't hear
the role of the devil, the snake.
Yeah. So there's a very rich subject, as you know, and I didn't say anything about it, for which I apologize. And you've already alluded to, in some ways, the most striking fact about, particularly in relation to the first question too, about the Muslim tradition is that there is not a strong, there's some emphasis, and it's a very rich, complicated tradition, obviously, but not central emphasis on the culpability of Eve. It's not a tradition that stigmatizes the woman in its sort of central motifs. On the contrary, it treats both the first man and the first woman as Muslim in the etymological sense of those who have submitted to God, and they are therefore, in the way that Muhammad was a Muslim, submitted, and therefore are also prophets. So Adam and Eve in the Muslim tradition are understood not first and foremost as sinners who introduced original sin into the world, but as prophets in the line that will lead to the prophet. At least I believe that's the case. I wouldn't want to take a very advanced exam on any of this, but insofar as I understand this. And then in the Muslim tradition, the serpent, sometimes not understood only to be a serpent, but it could be a camel in some of the hadith. The tempter is Iblis, the Muslim equivalent of Satan. As you probably know, there is no Satan in the biblical, in the Genesis story. There's a man, a naked woman, and a talking snake. No explanation is given as to why the snake is talking, except that he's the most cunning of the creatures, and there's no account of a motive that would explain why he's doing this. So that there's a huge and rich tradition, like so many things in the story, that comes to try to figure out what on earth to make of this. What is the motive here? Why wasn't it given? So the motive, as it's developed to a modest extent in a Jewish lore, but to a profound and rich extent in both Christian and Muslim lore, is to think that there's an enemy, the enemy who was rebelled out of pride, refused to submit, who was precisely not, in that literal sense, a Muslim, who's rebelled against the non-Muslim, who's rebelled against God, refused to bow and submit out of pride, and who therefore it wants to lure us into a comparable rebellion. That's my basic understanding of at the simplest level. Yes. Hi, Werner.
Hi. Very enjoyable, as always, Stephen. This last question made me ask a question. Which one is the better question to ask? Why is Christianity so friendly to representing holy stories? Or is the other question better, why are Judaism and Islam so hostile to visual representation of different variants of the same stories?
Yes. This is as you I'm sure know, this is a subject of an enormous literature, none of which has a kind of single speculative, single satisfying answer. I mean, I think I don't know, Werner. I would have said that the one piece of the answer is that Christianity developed in the Roman world, that world did not inherit that this only slightly evades the question, did not inherit the anti-iconographic tradition of the desert peoples, of the Middle Eastern peoples. There were some representations. Jews did some iconic representations, and early Muslims did some as well, but generally under the prohibition of as if it were a kind of challenge to God, as if it were challenging something that only God could do, which is to form a human being. But that's only an explanation, a kind of second-order explanation of why they had this fundamental resistance to the idea of depicting human beings. Whereas Christianity arose in a world in which people were constantly surrounded by representations of gods and humans, and in which to destroy all of those, though it was occasionally done, and of course the test case is the Byzantine world, which had periodic outbursts of violent iconophobia. The Christians, as they took these stories over into the Roman world, decided to embrace the representation of God, not as a violation of God's right to create, but as actually a gift that's given to us by God. I'm working now, I've been writing for some months about a late 2nd century work by Minucius Felix called the Octavius. I'm sure you all know it intimately. It's a very early piece of Christian apologetics, one of the earliest, from about 190 or 192. And it begins with three lawyers. Sounds like a joke. 3 lawyers take a walk on the beach. Three lawyers who are at the law courts in Rome decide to have a walk on the beach. And there are 2 Christians and there's a polytheist. And they're walking, they take their sandals off and they walk on the sand, and they feel the delicious feeling of the sand under their feet, and they watch little children playing skipping stones in the water. It's an incredibly beautiful account. And the pagan, the polytheist, as he's walking along the beachfront in Ostia, which at that time had a beachfront, sees a statue of Serapis, and he blows a kiss to it. But that's all. And one of the Christians says to the other, we shouldn't allow our good friend to do something so terrible. And that, as far as I know, is the very earliest moment. It's a profound moment, even though it's negligible. Then they go into a conversation at the end of which the polytheist converts. I mean, it's a piece of apologetics. But it's the earliest moment in which you can detect that feeling. We mustn't let him do that. So you're at a crossroads to think of your question. And what does this mean? Do you stop people from having statues at which they're blowing kisses? And the Christians decided to go the other direction. They can blow the kiss, but it's the kiss at the Virgin. It's or ritual gesture toward the Virgin or toward the Savior, and we'll invest, as it were, our imaginative life in a comparably rich set of iconic representations of our stories, and we'll let those gestures take place. We won't try to stop them. And the rest is Venice and every other city that we're surrounded by, with innumerable representations of this kind.
Beautiful note. Of course, there's an honor tradition of thinking that it was God that sent the serpent to let history start. Otherwise, we would all be farmers in a garden. So let's thank the serpent. And I invite you all to buy the fruit of knowledge outside. There is a thank you studium. And thank you to Querini Stampalia. Thank you to our colleagues of UCSB for sharing this moment. And most of all, thank you to Stephen Greenblatt.
Thank you. That was fun. Sometimes there was any questions, but there was any questions. That was genuinely good.
Bert is there and he's joining us.